I didn't expect the apartment to change anything. I told myself it was temporary, a practical decision made for rent, proximity to work, and nothing more. When I dragged my suitcase through the narrow hallway for the first time, I believed my life was already arranged somewhere else, anchored by a relationship that existed mostly through phone calls and carefully scheduled visits. Ryan was still my boyfriend. That mattered, or at least, it was supposed to. Lucas opened the door before I had a chance to knock twice. He smiled easily, the kind of smile that didn't ask permission to stay. He was taller than I expected, dressed casually, and carried himself with an unstudied confidence that made the space feel immediately lived in. He took one look at my overstuffed bag and laughed, reaching for it without asking. That small assumption, of shared effort, shared space, should have warned me. The apartment itself was modest but warm. Sunlight pulled across the wooden floor, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. Lucas gave me a quick tour, pointing out practical things, the unreliable shower knob, the kitchen drawer that stuck, while filling the silence with easy commentary. He talked the way people do when they aren't afraid of pauses, and I found myself relaxing despite my instinct to stay guarded. My room was smaller than his, but it felt quiet in a way I appreciated. As I set my things down, Lucas leaned against the doorframe and asked about my job, my move, my life before this place. I mentioned Ryan naturally, almost reflexively, as if saying his name out loud would keep everything aligned. Lucas nodded, unfazed, only asking how long we'd been together. His tone held no judgment, no curiosity sharp enough to feel invasive. That made me talk more than I meant to. That first evening, we ordered takeout and ate on the couch, knees angled toward each other without touching. The conversation drifted easily, from work frustrations to childhood stories to the strange comfort of living with someone who had once been a stranger. Lucas listened closely, the kind of listener who made you feel like your words were being stored somewhere careful. When I mentioned that Ryan lived in another city, Lucas didn't comment. He only said long distance could be hard, and then changed the subject. As days passed, routines formed quickly. We learned each other's schedules, the sounds that meant the other was home, the shared habit of staying up too late. Sometimes we talked in the kitchen while one of us made tea. Other nights, we sat on the floor, backs against opposite sides of the couch, trading stories that felt too personal for how recently we'd met. Lucas spoke openly about loneliness, about how silence could feel heavier than noise. I found myself responding honestly, surprised by how little effort it took. Ryan and I still talked, but the conversations grew predictable. He asked how work was, how the apartment was shaping up. I gave him the clean version, the one without nuance. I didn't mention Lucas beyond practical updates. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was a narrowing of the truth, and I justified it by telling myself there was nothing worth explaining yet. One night, after a long day, Lucas knocked on my door and asked if I wanted to watch something. We ended up sitting on my bed because the living room felt too bright, too exposed. We watched half an episode and talked through the rest, voices low, laughter muted. At some point, the screen went dark, and neither of us moved to turn it back on. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It felt deliberate, almost chosen. When Lucas finally stood to leave, he hesitated, as if weighing something invisible. He smiled again, softer this time, and said goodnight. After the door closed, I lay back and stared at the ceiling, aware of a shift I couldn't yet name. Nothing had happened. No rules had been broken. And yet, something had begun to lean away from where it was meant to stay. I told myself it was just adjustment. New spaces always carried strange echoes. Still, as I listened to Lucas moving around in his room down the hall, I felt a quiet anticipation settle in, a feeling that this apartment wasn't just a place I was living in, but a situation I was slowly stepping into, one choice at a time. The closeness settled in quietly, without announcement. It appeared in small, reasonable ways, shared groceries, unplanned dinners, conversations that stretched past midnight because neither of us felt the urge to stop. Lucas and I didn't discuss boundaries because nothing obvious seemed to cross them. That absence of alarm made everything feel safe, almost innocent. Ryan noticed the change before I admitted it to myself. Our calls shortened, not from conflict but from distraction. I found myself checking the time more often, glancing toward my door as if expecting a knock. When Ryan asked what I'd been doing, I spoke vaguely. Work, settling in, the usual. He sounded tired, and I told myself it wasn't my fault. Distance did that to people. Distance explained everything, if you let it. Lucas filled the apartment with a steady presence. He worked odd hours, which meant our schedules overlapped unpredictably. Sometimes I came home to find him cooking, music playing softly, sleeves rolled up as if he belonged to the space more fully than I ever would. Other nights, he waited up for me without saying that was what he was doing. He just looked up from his phone and smiled, as if my arrival had been expected all along. We talked about things I didn't talk about with Ryan anymore. My doubts, my restlessness, the version of myself I felt stuck carrying. Lucas didn't rush to reassure me or fix anything. He listened, asked questions that cut close but never felt cruel. When I asked about his past, he answered honestly, without drama, admitting to mistakes and regrets with a calm acceptance that made him feel survivable. One evening, after a long silence stretched between us, Lucas said he liked how easy it felt to live together. The comment was simple, almost casual, but it stayed with me longer than it should have. I realized I cared about his approval in a way that unsettled me. I wanted to be seen by him, understood by him. That desire sharpened everything else. Ryan called later that night. His voice crackled faintly through the phone, the connection unstable. He talked about his week, about plans we kept postponing. I responded automatically, my attention divided. When he asked if something was wrong, I said no too quickly. The lie landed heavy, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unnecessary. I could have told him the truth, that I was tired, distracted, unsure. Instead, I protected the quiet world I was building inside the apartment. The first time Lucas fell asleep in my room, it happened by accident. We'd been talking, sitting against the headboard, lights off except for the glow from the window. The conversation slowed, then dissolved. I woke briefly to find him still there, breathing evenly, his jacket folded beside him. The realization sent a sharp awareness through me, but I didn't move. I told myself it would be rude to wake him. I told myself it didn't mean anything. In the morning, Lucas apologized lightly, rubbing his eyes, already reaching for humor. I laughed with him, keeping the moment small. But after he left, I sat on the edge of the bed longer than necessary, replaying the night. Nothing inappropriate had happened. Still, I felt like I'd been holding something fragile and hadn't put it down in time. From then on, I noticed how often I chose Lucas without choosing him. I stayed up to talk when I should have slept. I postponed calls with Ryan because the timing felt inconvenient. I began to anticipate Lucas's moods, his footsteps, the sound of his laugh through the wall. Each choice seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't want to name. Guilt arrived late and lingered quietly. It wasn't sharp enough to force action, only present enough to remind me that I was drifting. I told myself I was still loyal, still careful. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is where it went wrong. But one night, as Lucas and I sat close on the couch, shoulders nearly touching, I realized something had already shifted beyond intention. I wasn't wondering if this was dangerous anymore. I was wondering how long I could pretend it wasn't. The night it happened didn't arrive with drama. There was no argument, no confession, no reckless decision announced aloud. It came quietly, disguised as circumstance, which made it harder to resist and easier to regret. A storm rolled in after sunset, the kind that pressed against the windows and unsettled the air. The apartment lost power just after midnight, plunging the rooms into a dense, unfamiliar darkness. Lucas knocked on my door a few minutes later, holding his phone like a weak lantern. He laughed it off, saying the circuit breaker always struggled in bad weather. His voice sounded closer than usual, more careful. We sat on my bed because it was the only place that felt anchored in the dark. The rain beat steadily outside, filling the pauses between our words. We talked at first, about trivial things, about how quiet the city sounded without electricity, but the conversation thinned quickly. Silence took over, heavy but not uncomfortable. I could hear Lucas breathing, steady and unguarded. I thought of Ryan then, alone in his apartment miles away, probably asleep. The image felt distant, like a memory I hadn't visited in a while. I told myself that this moment didn't threaten anything real. We were just waiting out the storm. We were just roommates sharing space. Lucas shifted closer so we could both lean against the headboard. Our shoulders touched, briefly at first, then with intention neither of us acknowledged. The contact sent a quick awareness through me, sharp enough to make my breath catch. I didn't pull away. That choice, small, quiet, echoed louder than any thunder outside. "Is this okay?" Lucas asked softly, not looking at me. I nodded before I could think better of it. The honesty of his question made it harder to pretend ignorance. He wasn't assuming. He was giving me an opening to stop things, to redraw a line. I let it pass. The storm stretched on, unhurried. Lucas lay back, hands folded loosely on his chest, eyes closed. After a moment, I did the same, staring up into darkness. The bed felt smaller with him there, every shift of movement magnified. I was aware of the warmth between us, of the way the silence had changed character. It wasn't empty anymore, it was expectant. When Lucas's hand brushed mine, it was accidental enough to excuse. When it stayed there, palm warm against my fingers, the excuse disappeared. I told myself to move, to say something light and decisive. Instead, I stayed still, letting the moment settle into place. I wasn't thinking about desire in clear terms. What I felt was relief. The kind that comes from being understood without explanation, from sharing space without performance. That realization scared me more than the touch itself. It meant this wasn't a mistake born of impulse. It was something I had been leaning toward, step by careful step. Lucas turned his head slightly, close enough that I could feel the shift of air. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. The closeness carried its own language, one built from weeks of late nights and shared silences. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to avoid seeing the choice I was making. We stayed like that longer than made sense, neither crossing further, neither retreating. When the rain finally softened and the power flickered back on, the light felt intrusive. Lucas withdrew his hand slowly, as if giving me time to object. I didn't. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, and apologized again, though his voice lacked conviction. I told him it was fine. The words sounded thin, inadequate. He hesitated, then asked if he should go back to his room. I shook my head. The answer surprised us both. Lucas lay down beside me, facing the opposite direction, a respectful distance between us that only highlighted how close we'd already been. As the apartment hummed back to life, I stared at the wall and felt a quiet certainty settle in. Nothing dramatic had happened. No rules had been shattered openly. And yet, I knew with unsettling clarity that I had crossed a line I wouldn't be able to redraw. Sleep came slowly. When it did, it carried the weight of what I hadn't said, and the knowledge that morning would demand something from me I wasn't ready to give. Morning arrived without ceremony. The light filtered through the curtains as if nothing in the apartment had shifted, as if the night had been ordinary. Lucas was already awake when I stirred, sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone with studied neutrality. He glanced at me, offered a small smile, and stood up, giving me space without being asked. That courtesy made my chest tighten. We didn't talk about what had happened. Not immediately. Lucas busied himself in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of routine returning, cups clinking, water running. I stayed in my room longer than usual, replaying the night in fragments. Nothing explicit rose to accuse me. No single image could be isolated and condemned. That ambiguity felt like both a shield and a sentence. Ryan called mid-morning. I watched the phone ring, the name lighting up the screen, and felt a reflexive urge to silence it. I answered instead, forcing steadiness into my voice. He sounded cheerful, unaware, telling me about his plans for the weekend. I responded where expected, laughed where appropriate, all while measuring each word. The conversation ended without conflict, which somehow made it worse. There was no rupture dramatic enough to justify my guilt. Lucas and I crossed paths cautiously that afternoon. He asked if I wanted coffee, his tone neutral, respectful. I agreed. We sat across from each other at the small table, the distance deliberate. He spoke first, saying he hoped I was okay. The concern in his voice wasn't possessive or apologetic. It was sincere, and that sincerity stripped away my defenses. I should have stopped it, I said, more to myself than to him. Lucas nodded slowly. We both could have. There was no argument in his reply, no attempt to shift blame. That mutual acknowledgement made the situation real in a way silence hadn't. We weren't pretending anymore, but we also weren't dramatizing it. What had happened existed in a narrow space between significance and restraint. I spent the rest of the day restless, unable to focus on anything long enough to escape my thoughts. I considered telling Ryan the truth, then imagined the explanations I'd have to offer. None of them felt complete. How do you describe a betrayal that lives more in intention than action? How do you confess to something quiet? That evening, Lucas knocked on my door again, this time with purpose. He said we needed to be careful, that he didn't want to be the reason I hurt someone I cared about. The words mattered less than the way he said them, firm but not distant. He wasn't pushing me away. He was asking me to choose. After he left, I sat alone, listening to the apartment settle into its nighttime sounds. I thought about Ryan, about the version of myself I'd been when that relationship began. I thought about Lucas, about how easily he had become part of my daily rhythm. The contrast wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, and that subtlety frightened me. I realized then that infidelity wasn't always a sudden collapse. Sometimes it was erosion, a slow wearing away of certainty until you stepped over a line without ever seeing it clearly drawn. I hadn't been careless, I had been quiet, I had allowed comfort to replace clarity. I didn't make any grand decisions that night. There was no confrontation, no resolution packaged neatly for relief. What I did was acknowledge the truth I'd been avoiding. Something had changed, and ignoring it would only deepen the damage.
As I turned off the light, I understood that the story wasn't over. Whether it ended in confession, distance, or loss remained uncertain. What I knew, with calm and uncomfortable certainty, was that sharing a bed had been the least important part of what I'd done. The real crossing had happened long before, and whatever came next would ask me to face that honestly.